In the past few weeks, a renewed controversy has raged across this nation over the role pornography plays in our society, particularly hardcore, violent pornography, and its link to violent sexual behavior. It's become a firestorm in the media following the execution of convicted serial killer Ted Bundy in the Florida State Prison. In an exclusive interview just hours before his death, Bundy told how pornography fueled and crystallized his own homicidal sexual fantasies. Bundy was interviewed by psychologist and author Dr. James Dobson, who is president of the California-based Focus on the Family. That dramatic footage has become the focus of the debate and constitutes the last formal statement of a condemned murderer. I talked about it with Dr. Dobson at his headquarters in Pomona, California. Dr. Dobson, it's been fascinating to read the aftermath in the press of this event that happened at the Florida State Prison, the circus that occurred outside, the interview inside, and then what happened afterward. And it's curious to me that more criticism was leveled at you than was leveled at Bundy. That's why I would like to establish, first of all, who you are and what your credentials are in the professional community. Can you do that for me?
Brian, it's interesting that I come off bad in comparison with a man who killed 28 women and children. I mean, I need a new press agent, I suppose, under those circumstances. I think what that reflects is an effort to discredit the messenger. What we had to say, what Bundy had to say, and some of my own conclusions about it are unacceptable to the media, or at least to some members of the media, and so there's been this effort to confuse who I am. I've been called a televangelist, to identify me with some of the embarrassing things that happened in Christendom a few years ago. Yeah. I've been called a minister and so on. It is true that I have a radio program on 1,300 Christian radio stations, but to say that that makes me a minister is like saying if you live in Orange County, you're a citrus grower.
Right. Well, you were called a religious broadcaster, in fact, in most of the articles that I saw, and I wouldn't characterize you as a religious broadcaster.
Well,
How would you characterize yourself?
I have a PhD in child development from the University of Southern California. I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of California. I served on the faculty of the medical school at the University of Southern California for 14 years. I served at the same time for 17 years on the attending staff of Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. So my background is in the area of research and child development. I am not a minister. I've never been to seminary. I have absolutely no credentials there. If I were, I would be proud of that fact, but I'm not. That's not who I am.
Your leap into prominence really began with Dare to Discipline, a book you wrote in 1970. It was published in 1970, yes. And which has sold, I guess, what, millions of copies by now. And that catapulted you into the public. You became more of a public figure at that point. And then you formed this organization, Focus on the Family, which was to promote family-oriented goals, I presume.
That's correct. I left USC and Children's Hospital in order to propagate some of the values that I believe in. I've been concerned about the family and the things that undermine it, and pornography is only one of those threats to the family, but it's a very important one.
One of the criticisms of you was that you were not a qualified interviewer, as though someone from the networks, for example, could have done a better job. And yet, as a psychologist, it seems that you must have interviewed hundreds or thousands of people in your professional career, that's much of what a psychologist does.
Well, beyond that, as I said earlier, I have a radio program on 1,300 stations every day, 30 minutes a day. I'm heard 10,200 times per week, 10,200 half hours per week in 25 countries. And most of those are interview-type programs. So I don't know what you have to do to be a qualified interviewer. But again, see, that's an assault. That's an effort to discredit the man who was saying something that agitates those who disagree with it.
Right. There was something that really was serious, and that was the intimation or direct statements that you were trying to use Bundy as a stepping stone to make money. That somehow you were going to package the interview or sell it to the networks, or there was some marketing plan where you could use this as a way of making money. I'd like you to speak to that issue.
Brian, that's the most insulting of all. And again, you see the effort to associate me with the so-called televangelist and the problems that occurred regarding money in the past. If they can link me somehow to a ripoff in this thing, then it discredits why I went to Florida and why I talked to Ted Bundy. Let me give you the truth about that matter. I walked out of the prison with the only videotaped interview with Ted Bundy. You know how supply and demand works. I mean, the supply was one videotape. The demand was enormous. All the news media in the United States and many from around the world were there. And we could have sold that tape for a small fortune. We were offered $500,000 for it for a 12-hour delay. In other words, if we just give one media source a 12-hour scoop with that tape, they'd give us $500,000. Money was waved at us from all directions. We were offered $50,000, $25,000. Instead, we rejected all of that, went into a studio and edited the final 29-minute and 30-second interview and came back at our expense and gave that to everybody who wanted it. There was no favoritism. Anybody who wanted it left with that information at our expense. It cost $40,000 to go down there and videotape this interview, and we gave it away. Now, after we got home, there were hundreds and even thousands of requests for that interview on videotape. As you know, videotape cost money. Now, our accounting department has calculated that if 4,000 requests for this videotape come, and that's what we anticipated. Could be a little more, could be a little less. But if 4,000 copies come, it will cost us, in actual expense, right at $23.90 per tape to send those out. And so we've asked for a $25 donation. Now, there's one other thing that you need to know. This is what NBC called minister cashes in on Bundy. There was a news flash that actually said that. The Associated Press said something very similar. But the agreement that Ted Bundy signed at 10 o'clock at night before he was executed the next morning says that he wanted any excess money that came from the distribution of this video to go first to underwrite the expenses of doing the video, and any other monies that might come must, he used the word must go to the fight against violent pornography. So if there was any extra money, and at this point there is none, and it looks like there will be none, if there was any extra money, it would go exclusively to that purpose. Now, if that's what they call cashing in, it's not my understanding of the word.
Could you very quickly give us a chronology of what happened there? Because he contacted you first, apparently, because of your involvement on the President's Commission on Pornography and the fact that you were a psychologist. Is that true?
Yes. My first contact with Ted Bundy came approximately 2 years ago. It was December 1986. He got in touch with me through an intermediary and said that there would come a time when he wanted to make a statement about his circumstances. Without incriminating himself, he implied that he wanted to admit his guilt, and much more explicitly, he said he wanted to make a statement about pornography and the role that it had played in fueling his own passions. He didn't believe the press would allow that message to get to the people. He felt they would distort it or ignore it or in some way discredit it. And so he asked if when that moment came, would I come to Florida and interview him. He had been aware of my service on the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography. That's a 2,000-page report that came out of that commission. He had read the entire report, one of the very few people I know who did. He was very knowledgeable of the subject and felt very, very strongly about it. And he wanted to make sure that that message that he wanted to convey about the role that it had played in his life did not get edited in some way. Yeah.
What was your reaction when you got this initial, nibble? What was your reaction? In other words, well, can I trust the man? Will he be telling the truth? Is he going to do a number on me the way he apparently has with other people? How did you react to that initially?
Sure, I had questions about that. I read the book, The Only Living Witness, and the things that he's done are horrible. I want to make it really very clear, Brian, that I did not go to Florida as Ted Bundy's apologist. You know, I'm not here to say this was a great man that was misunderstood, nor did I go there to try to get a stay of execution for him. That was not my purpose. And having read the book and been aware of his arrogance and aware of the way he manipulated the press and the people in the past, I did go there with some skepticism, and for good reason. I mean, look at the man's history. But by the time I got there, that had changed. He was looking death in the face. He was 15 hours, 16 hours away from the electric chair. He was a frightened, broken man by that point. He was deeply remorseful, too, I believe.
Many of the members of the press have said that they felt he was doing a con job to the end. Did you ever have any suspicion that he was conning you, that he was lying to you, that he was using you in some way that wasn't clearly expressed in your previous communication?
I didn't think that then, and I don't believe that now. I have correspondence, direct correspondence between the two of us that goes back to August of last year. He sent me an 11-page letter in August. The theme of that letter was his concern about violent pornography. He had read the reports. He knew the scientific studies. He was very informed on that subject because he felt that it had destroyed his life or contributed to the destruction of his life, but also resulted in the death of many innocent people. And there was a consistent pattern. Every letter that he sent me focused on that issue. So there wasn't anything strange that happened in that last interview a few hours before his death.
So you feel it was, in fact, the last honest statements of a condemned man?
Brian, the best answer to that question will come from watching the video. Listen to the man's voice. Look into his eyes and draw your own conclusions. I think it's obvious. None of the explanations that have been given by those who disbelieve Ted Bundy seem to make sense to me. They've said that he was trying to get rid of the guilt. He was trying to accommodate the investigators and so on. A man who does not want to die does not confess to 28 murders. A man who wants sympathy does not tell the world how he raped and dismembered all those innocent people.
Confessing to more crimes was not a method
motive could he have
prolonging
had?
his life.
It makes no sense at all. The man was making his final statement. I believe that. If other people don't believe it, they're free to believe what they want to.
Dr. Dobson, after the seriousness and quiet drama of that interview, what was your reaction when you went outside the prison to this almost circus-like atmosphere that existed there?
Brian, it was really terrible. It had actually been there for a couple of days. People were just having an awful lot of fun with this thing. There were signs, burn, Bundy, burn. Tuesday is Friday. Some of them even more insulting than that. And there was a carnival atmosphere. It was almost like a Roman gladiator kind of thing. The people were just really enjoying it. And there was a lot of laughter and Roman candles and all kinds of stuff. When Bundy was finally executed the next morning, they came out and they signaled that he was gone, and then the hearse came in, big white hearse came in, picked up his body. When it drove past them, you would have thought it was the Super Bowl. I mean, there was a great emotional response, cheers, laughter, and so on. And that made me a little sick at my stomach, to be honest with you. I understand the frustration with the legal system that allowed this man to escape justice for so long. That's really what they were saying. And I understand the irritation by the people of the state of Florida and Colorado and Washington State with the terror that he inflicted upon them. So I understand the way they felt about Ted Bundy, no question about that. But it is still an awesome thing to take a human life, even when it must be done in circumstances like this. And it must be done with a certain dignity. You know, and I felt like the human family, the human race, was denigrated by that immature, almost adolescent emotional display that took place around the death of this man.
Dr. Dobson, some people might try to avoid the conclusions that Bundy mentioned to you by saying he was crazy, that he was nuts, that you cannot give any credence to the statements of a deranged man. Was he, in fact, a psychopath?
Well, he certainly was not psychotic in the sense of not being able to tell the difference between right and wrong or not being in touch with reality. I mean, he was a very articulate, a very bright person. You can see that on the video. He was able to communicate very well. Now, he probably did have psychopathic characteristics. I mean, there was something there that made him vulnerable to that violent pornography, and there was something that weakened his ability to deal with that. I don't know much about his childhood, and I don't know much about his family. You heard what he said about it. But it is interesting, Brian, that when you go back to the Nazi era, it was not difficult for the Nazi warlords to find people to do the kind of things that Ted Bundy did. I mean, they found them by the thousands in society.
Yes, hundreds of thousands.
That's
fact,
right,
yes.
to kill Jews and Poles and Gypsies and those who are unarmed, women and children, kill little babies, put them in a pit and shoot them. You wouldn't think you could find people to do that. After the war, they did psychological studies and testing on those individuals, and they found for the most part they were not psychopathic. What had actually happened was they were given a rationale for this kind of killing,
right,
and then they were desensitized to it till they got to the place that they didn't feel anymore. And Ted talks about that desensitization. The first woman that he killed, for 6 months, he went through an internal agony over it. But the next time he killed somebody under that frenzy, it didn't last quite as long, and it wasn't as intense. And he got to the place where he couldn't even feel anymore. You don't have to be psychopathic to go through that desensitization process. I think Ted was, but it would not be necessary to do what he did.
The link between pornography and violence, can you generalize a little bit about what studies have been done or what we know about the link between depictions of violence in pornography or in other places and violent behavior?
Let's talk about what Ted referred to. He mentioned the FBI studies. He said their own studies show. What he was referring to is a study of 36 serial murderers. 36 convicted murderers who had killed multiple numbers of people. Of the 36, 29 of them, or 81%, listed as their predominant interest to the level of a compulsion the matter of pornography, and mostly violent, hardcore pornography. Now, that's circumstantial evidence, admittedly. I mean, that's not the general population. These are 36 people who did this. But it's pretty convincing. You know, there is a reason why the psychiatrists and the psychologists are saying that there are no hard studies, there's no hard scientific data to link those two things together. The reason is that it's almost impossible to study. I mean, research is very difficult to do. How many years did it take us to show that there was a link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer? It took decades. And many studies, we're still arguing over cholesterol and what its role is. And these are pretty concrete things that you can measure and that you can see. When it comes to human behavior, it is very difficult to prove anything. So when they say it has not been proved in the sense of a double-blind study that meets all the rigors of the scientific method, that is true. You can't do that kind of study. It will never be done. It's not that we did them and that they didn't show a linkage, it's that you can't do them. Because in order to do it, you would have to go to the men who hang around adult bookstores, the men who are into that stuff and hooked on it, and you'd have to put them into two groups, and one group you would expose to this stuff and the other group you didn't, or you would take adolescent males who are 18 years of age and you flood one group with violent pornography and you don't expose the other one to it at all and see what happens. You can't do that. It's unethical. You'll never do those kind of studies. But the circumstantial evidence is absolutely overwhelming.
I can remember back in the early 70s there were studies showing that children tended to resort to violent solutions to their problems as the result of seeing violent behavior depicted on television and in the movies. Have those studies been upgraded? I mean, now we're talking about a general thing that's available to us all. Anybody can turn on the television. There are murders and stabbings and killings and brutalities of all sorts on TV every day.
Yeah. There are studies, one done at UCLA by Malamuth and Fishbeck, which took college sophomores, males. They showed them violent pornography, and then they asked them the question, if you had an opportunity to rape a woman with impunity, you would never get caught, would you do it? 51% said yes. Now, this is a cross-section of university sophomores. So there are studies like that. As I said before, they're not absolutely definitive, but common sense tells you there's a connection between the two. For example, you mentioned movies just now. You remember several years ago when the movie E.T. was popular, extraterrestrial. Do you remember that there was a scene when candy was exchanged between the extraterrestrial, E.T., and the little boy? And children in the audience saw that candy. It was only on screen for 6 or 8 seconds. They saw it and recognized it as Reese's Pieces. Nobody ever said Reese's Pieces. They saw it, they recognized it. Yep. And they went out and bought that candy in the millions of dollars worth. I mean, the company made a fortune on it. Now, what actually happened was what they saw on the screen influenced behavior. And that's 6 seconds. What about in a violent movie done, you know, the Halloween type movie, where you've got an hour and a half of nothing but killing and raping and maiming for people who are themselves a little flaky. And they're telling us that it has no power to influence. Why do advertisers spend billions of dollars to put their message on the screen? It's because what you see influences what you do. And only in pornography are we afraid to make that linkage. And yet that linkage is very, very clear. You may know that I served on the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography. I spent 2 years examining this stuff. And it's really very interesting to know the outcome of that commission, Brian. The press reported it as a whitewash, that it was a Reagan administration appointment of 11 people who went into this examination of pornography with their minds already made up. The truth of the matter is we were a very diverse commission. It was made up of men and women. It was made up of liberals and conservatives. It was made up of Christians and Jews and atheists. It was made up of judges and psychologists and psychiatrists, a publisher, a priest, a social worker. I mean, it was a very diverse commission with very diverse opinions about things.
And not all of the people on the commission were anti-pornography.
Oh, we split on most votes 6 to 5. I mean, we were divided right down the middle. Yet when it came to that link between violence in pornography and violence against women and children, the vote was 11 to nothing. I mean, we couldn't agree on anything, but on that issue, everybody saw it. You examine it for a year and a half and hear the testimony, and it's undeniable. That's why it bothers me now that these psychiatrists and psychologists are rushing out of their university towers to say there is no link between the two. And they're wrong. In this case, they're dead wrong. Brian, I think it's very important for people to know what we're talking about here, because the general public is confused over the difference between softcore pornography and hardcore violent pornography. They tend to think of them as one. If you stop people on the street and you ask them what hardcore pornography is, they will tell you it is the pictures in Playboy magazine or Penthouse magazine or so on. That's softcore.
Right.
And that's the doorway to hardcore violent pornography. I mean, people get hooked here and get taken across to this more extreme level. But hardcore violent pornography is so offensive, and most people would be sickened if they saw it. I mean, I'm talking about, and forgive me for being explicit, but we need to know, I'm talking about nude women who are being beaten and whipped and hit with boards or guns fired right straight into the face. We're talking about broom handles thrust into the body cavities. We're talking about horses having sex with women against their will. We're talking about the body being mutilated and cut in every way possible, especially the genitalia. Or we're talking about nude women whose throats are cut and graphically they show blood just gushing all over everywhere. We're talking about such wretched stuff. And these behavioral scientists are going on CBS Morning News and the Today Show and ABC Morning News and so on. And they are trying to tell us that that kind of material does not have an effect on the behavior of a psychopath like Ted Bundy when under the influence of alcohol, and that his passions are not fueled by it, that it doesn't play a role. It won't wash. Ask the women of the world. Forget the behavioral sciences. Go out on the street and ask the women if they feel comfortable with their own modesty being assaulted in that way, and with that material getting into the hands of the men who may be in their community and their neighborhoods. They'll tell you whether there's a link or not.
Without question, the debate will continue. The entrepreneurs of porn have made it clear they're in business to stay, and they claim they have constitutional license in the First Amendment. Agreeing with them on that point are many influential Americans who, while they do not support porn, have an almost overpowering fear of censorship. Opposing them are many pro-family and religious groups who view porn as a benchmark of social breakdown. As society is a reflection of its individuals, each of us must ultimately decide where to draw the line. At what point do you say, no more?